developments beyond what we see in the news happening in Gaza and in Israel. Over the last 7 months of fighting, there were a lot of changes happening in Israel, in Israel's foreign policy and foreign relations. A lot of that is being played out in the regional ties between Israel and its Arab and Muslim neighbors. And within that, the economic side of things is becoming very important. The war began at a time in which there was some positive momentum between Israel and its neighbors. Of course, that already slowed down a bit with the coming to power of the recent Netanyahu coalition more than a year ago. But after the Abraham Accords and given the peace treaties that Israel already have in the region, we saw advancement in terms of bilateral relations, in terms of minilateral, multilateral, regional cooperation. And we want to check today what has happened to that in light of the war. What succeeded to carry on, what stopped, what prospects we see towards the future, and also look at it from a bit of an academic theoretic point of view. We have 4 speakers today that will cover different aspects of these issues. We'll be talking about peace and international relations and regional cooperation and economy. We'll be talking about bilateral trade relations. We'll be talking about the Palestinian issue and how cooperation between Israel and the PA. We'll be speaking about Turkey. There's a lot of crisis between Israel and Turkey, also economic issues. We'll be talking about energy. We have with us Professor Galia Press-Bar Natan, who is a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's a director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations. Welcome, Galia. We have Dan Katarivas, president of the Federation of Binational Chambers of Commerce in Israel, and has been working on economic relations between Israel and its neighbors for decades. Gabi Bar is the president of the Israeli-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It's very important that such a mechanism institute actually exists in Israel, and Gabi also has a lot of background in the government, working on regional relations from the governmental side. And Gabriel Mitchell, the director of undergraduate studies at Notre Dame Jerusalem, and a big expert on energy on East Med issues. So each one has their topic and their issues, and I'm glad to jumpstart our conversation. And starting it with you, Galia, based on your long-standing research and academic evaluation of the role of economy in peace processes, in regional cooperation, get us started with kind of a big picture, zooming out, look at that, and then we'll go more deeper into Israel and what changed during the war.
Okay, thank you for having me here. So my role is the big picture, and I would say a few things. I would say that, and I'm an international relations scholar, I think there are 2 big ways you can look at the links between economics and peace and transitions to peace. On the one hand, we can just talk about economic power resources as a power resource, as a source of leverage over another party. So we can talk about the promise of economic incentives, foreign aid, opening markets, or the opposite leverage, negative leverage of using economic negative sanctions. And both can be used by powerful actors to change the cost-benefit calculations of other parties, and we are assuming rational actors, and we can talk about that afterwards. And this can be used to encourage governments or force them to make bold or costly or potentially risky policy choices about shift to peace, ending wars, and things like that. We need to remember that the same logic of using economic resources as just a power resource can also be used just as a tool to manage effectively conflicts. That is making escalation costly for both sides. I'm mentioning this because I think very often people use the rhetoric of economics for peace, but in practice, what they mean or what we see is using economics for better conflict management, and it's not the same thing. A second, more sophisticated way of looking at the link between economics and peace or security is what is often referred to as the so-called economic peace or commercial peace approach in our field. And it builds on a somewhat different logic. The idea here is that we try to create a new structural constraint to conflict through the development of mutual economic interdependence between the parties. And the basic argument is that mutual economic interdependence will make war costly to both sides because war will disrupt the normal economic relations, trade, investment, and so on. And therefore, the logic goes in times of crisis, both parties will be very careful not to deteriorate into major violence because it will be costly for both sides. Now, there are a lot of problems with this theory, and we can talk about this afterwards, but I would say that it's very powerful when we are talking about states that have thriving operating market economies, where you have various private actors, not just governments, that have high stake in maintaining trade. And of course, this has implications for our region as well. Some argue that democracy is crucial for this to work. Many others suggest that that is not the case. Think of China, and what you really need as a necessary condition is a functioning government, a functioning state with a market economy. I would say that the big challenge, however, is how to get there, how to get to the situation where we have the European Union with states that have a very high level of economic interdependence with each other, especially when we're talking about conflictual regions like the Middle East. So in order for this economic logic to actually kick in, you need a set of political decisions to try to foster this interdependence, and that is exactly the big challenge, because economic resources can be translated also into other military and other less attractive resources, therefore creating a lot of concern. And at the same time, there's going to be concern about growing dependence on the other side. So there are a lot of obstacles to actually try to get to this high level of interdependence. Very briefly, I want to make one last two last observations for my 5 minutes for this question. First, the vision, what we think about when we think about like the EU, is that once you have a high level of economic interdependence, over time, this will actually translate into other things, into closer societal ties. And when these peace dividends actually trickle down to society, this is going to form a strong, stable, and resilient relationship, even in times of hardship. Finally, the one last thing I wanted to say is that we can think about economics and peace in two ways. First, as I tried to say, there is a strong economic logic when you have a high level of interdependent states to actually make this to create these stable, peaceful relations. And when it exists, it's very powerful. At the same time, there's also a political logic to try to use economics to promote peace. And that's not the same, because very often this political logic doesn't always lead to the compelling outcomes, exactly because of its political nature. The one caveat, and I'll move to the next question soon, is that most of this literature, I would say 95% of the literature, deals with interstate relations. And this raises big questions about what happens when you talk about the use of economic tools vis-a-vis non-state actors. That's obviously a big part of what we're looking at now. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Galia, thank you for this introduction and for getting us into the topic. When you move from this big picture analysis and insights into the case study that you're so familiar with, of what's happening in Israel and between Israel and its neighbors, whether the Arab countries or whether the Palestinian Authority, how does that play in? So what did you see in terms of the economic aspects of these regional relations as they have been being forged over the last few years? And what are the major changes that you see since the war began in terms of these economic concepts?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that we've seen throughout the years since the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, we've basically seen the different concepts that I examined before used to try to promote peace in the region, with some success, though limited. I think what we mostly saw was the use of economic tools by third parties, mostly the US and, of course, the Europeans, though not together, in order to try to promote transitions to peace. My first logic of just using economic incentives was obviously a very central element in the transition to peace between Egypt and Israel, and Jordan and Israel, where the huge aid packages that the Americans provided played a crucial role, also because they impacted domestic security in Jordan and in Egypt. The Abraham Accords 2020 also involved these fat economic carrots. So this is like the first logic I talked about. However, I think it became very obvious that those who actually wanted to deepen and stabilize peaceful relations discovered that these incentives were very important as the tipping point to actually get to the agreement, but had a limited long-term impact because they meant that the relationship remained dependent on this constant provision of these incentives, and they didn't contribute to building any direct long-term economic ties between the parties. Exactly those ties that could generate my second logic, this interdependence that makes the relationship much more resilient. And one of the consequences of this was the shift in strategy of the US to try to foster more direct economic relations between Israel and its neighbors. And probably the best example is the example of the quiz agreements, the qualifying industrial zones. Gabi Bar is here, and everything I know about the quizzes I learned from him, so I'll be very brief. But the idea here is that for the Americans to try to create built-in incentives for Israelis and Egyptians, or earlier on Israelis and Jordanians, to cooperate together to produce a product that would then receive easy entry into the American market without tariffs. So it was an attempt to try to build direct bilateral incentives to cooperate between these parties in order to get into the big bonus, which is the American market. Now, over time, and of course, Gabi can say much more about this, these arrangements, on the one hand, did not grow and thrive dramatically, but at the same time, it's very important to note that they remain surprisingly resilient. And I think it does go to show that when there are real economic benefits for neighboring states, leaders will follow through despite political difficulties. This being said, and I ended before talking about the economic and the political logics of using economic tools. The way I think about it, I see today that economic cooperation, even when it does have real economic value to it, is more likely to succeed exactly when it is not framed as a tool to promote peace or normalization. So it's almost economic cooperation despite peace. So if you want to, when Israel tries to frame these things as, a tool to promote peace, that very often creates more damage than good. What does this mean in the context of Gaza and what's happened since the war? I'll make I was a bit slow, so I'll make a few brief comments, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Gabi and Dan and Gabi. First, the big question for me is whether the same logic that I described before applies to a non-state actor. Is the key here that it's a non-state actor, or is it about the nature, the ideology of the actor? Are fundamentalist actors maybe holding different ordering of preferences that we need to consider? Obviously, the logic of economic incentives that I talked about was used vis-a-vis Hamas, and we know that. And that was part of what we now call the conception, always like a hindsight argument, that peace can be bought. And obviously, we know that that did not work. Does that mean that the theory failed? I'm often asked. I'm not sure. First, because it was never about peace. It was about conflict management. And secondly, we never got to that part of actually using these economic relations to build an economic infrastructure upon which market relations could somehow evolve. The war, I think, actually presents a very interesting test to the different logics I presented. I think the jury is not out yet. On the one hand, we see the leverage of powerful states over Israel through economic sanctions, and we will hear afterwards, I'm sure, about Turkey on the one hand, grassroots pressures, BDS in Western Europe. And on the other hand, when we look at the Arab world, it will be a really good test to see the resilience or lack of these existing and also potential economic ties, think Saudi Arabia, and the extent that they will actually influence the reactions to the war. I think it will be very hard to disentangle the economic element because of the overwhelming geopolitical logic that is playing a role there. So I will stop there and we'll hear more real stuff now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gala. It's very real. And by the way, those of you who are tuning in and want to pose questions, you can write them in the Q&A box, and later on, we'll try to integrate them into the following up question with the speakers. Dan, I'm turning over to you. Galia already mentioned the relations with the Arab countries and how they change. You're following the numbers. You're having the contact with those countries. You are participating in all kind of regional and multilateral meetings over these last month. Give us a snapshot of what's actually the situation. What is the scope of economic relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors at the moment, and how did it really change or not change following October 7th?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, I think that we have to understand that, first of all, if we talk economics, so we must understand whether there is any reason or what are really the good reason of having economic ties with our neighbors, because we must understand that there is a big difference between the Israeli economy and the economy of the region. I know that usually, if you look at Europe, and I won't enter into the European integration process, but the countries there have a similar type of government, similar type of economy, market economy. When we talk about Israel and its neighbor, there is a huge difference, first of all, between the different neighbors, because Egypt is not Jordan in terms of size. Morocco is far away. The PA, Palestinian Authority, is something very proximity of Israel and doesn't have borders. We talk about the Emirates. It's something that we apparently have discovered with the Arab Accord, but actually I've been dealing with them for many years before. So economic ties of Israel, I don't think that we can look at the Arab world as a whole. We must make distinction between the various countries, between the complementarity that might exist between Israel and each of those countries, which is different. Okay, and people might be surprised, but our biggest partner in terms of trade and economic ties is actually the Palestinian. When you look around, but that's what Gabi is going to talk maybe about it. Though we have really almost a common market with the Palestinian. We have a custom envelope, and the exchanges there are very imbalanced. We sell much more than we buy from them, but on the other hand, they use, before the 7th of October, sent to us almost 200,000 workers, which was actually selling services, labor service to Israel. So the relations there are in totally different manner than they are with Egypt, where obviously Galia has mentioned the QIZ, which is definitely something that has been overcoming all changes of government in Egypt. Even during Morsi time, it continued to function, okay, and even enlarged. We had the biggest Egyptian delegation of officials coming to Israel during Morsi time, and organized a roadshow of Israeli and Egyptian businessmen in America. That was during the not very Zionist President Morsi, because he understood actually the economic advantage of that. When it comes to Jordan, here again, we signed a very detailed peace agreement with, I think, about 12 to 13 detailed G2G agreements in agriculture and in custom and in communication and in water, etc. When you look at the results, not much has happened. Why? Because Jordan is a very, unfortunately, very weak country, and it's very complicated to do business with. When we look at the Gulf, on the other hand, again, a lot has been happening before diplomatic relations between Israel and the Gulf country, especially Abu Dhabi, Dubai, less with Bahrain. And actually, when the Arab Accord exploded, we were in the phase of actually putting on the table what was going under the table. But again, if you look at the overall number, and for this seminar, I just checked the latest number of our trade with those countries. Yes, it's true. Since 2020, it all went up, okay? But again, let's put it into proportion when you look at the Israeli economy. The overall Israeli export to the Arab world, or to those countries which I've mentioned, I think is something like $800–700 million. And the imports are approximately the same. So we're talking about $1.5 billion, when Israel's total export are over $160 billion. So you see, it's not something which is actually extremely important or big in the balance of trade of Israel. Having said so, I think it's extremely important because peace with our neighbor, the economic dimension has to be developed. And there is a potential. And it's not only trade that we're talking about. I see that the cooperation between us and our neighbor, and with each of them in a different manner, is something which can go over trade. It's a mutual investment, joint project, tackling challenges of climate change, because we are in a very hot region. Therefore, the challenges of climate change is something that we share all together. So we have a lot that we can do together, not just trade. There are other ways. Mobility is certainly one thing which is very important, because this area is actually at the crossroad of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the Middle East and Israel in the middle can become a hub as long as the borders are open, as long as things can move, goods can move in and out in a very easy manner. It doesn't happen yet, but there is a potential. And obviously, also when you look at the population age, I mean, although this country are very, very young country, with actually, I would say, more than half of their population is under the age of 20. Therefore, there is a huge need to provide opportunity, hope in the economic field. And therefore, Israel and its neighbor have a lot to do in that area. So maybe the figure on the ground are not immense, but we can see that all those countries, and even after the 7th of October, the figures are continuing to grow, okay? With Egypt, we are now importing from Egypt probably more than before, because we are trying to replace what we could import from Turkey and we cannot by importing from Egypt. So you see the geopolitical also influence the type of relation. Jordan is becoming also important because we're importing via Jordan a lot of goods that come from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf. So also we are importing, and Israel is becoming also a transit for that. Morocco, there is a potential there, especially in the area of agriculture, but not only. Morocco is a very much developed now industrial economy, and we can see in the automotive sector a lot, and in the a lot of cooperation possible. So I can go sector by sector and to identify what is the potential. So the 7th of October definitely is a big event in the region, but as economy was not a major part of the relation in the past, I can hope that it's only going to get a better treatment in the future.
Dan, but how much of those numbers that you indicated suffered from the war? Because you present, quite a positive picture in which trade continues, but is it with all the Arab countries that you survey, or other specific countries with which economic ties have really suffered? Plus, look, what about the minilateral project? We saw how the project between Israel and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates on the exchange of water and electricity, that was put on hold by Jordan. That was a big project that Israel was eyeing. What does it mean for the East Med Gaza Forum or the UFM or the regional organization that brought Israel and the Arab countries together? In terms of economic activity, how much or where did you see things go in a different direction, in a more negative direction, because of the current crisis in the region?
Look, I think that we've been through the last, 30 years, 40 years I've been dealing with the region. There was a phase of project, cooperation, the new Middle East that our former President, Mr. Shimon Peres, was saying, and this is not something that was so much accepted by the Arab around. They have a Middle East, why to have a new Middle East? So, I mean, there was a phase of big project, big infrastructure project with government involvement, etc. I believe much more in the private sector and in step by step the development of relations. And we are definitely there. I mean, we are learning the business culture of our neighbors, okay? So you can say with Egypt, it's the last 40 years of peace. The economic dimension was not there because of many reasons. But I believe that it could happen. By the way, it can happen through, for instance, the fact that the Emirates are now investing $35 billion in Egypt, because they understand they have to actually make Egypt sustainable. And maybe in that $35 billion of project, you might find Israeli companies that might actually go hand in hand with the Emirates in Egypt. So it's not just a bilateral, but here you have the source of finance of the Emirates in Egypt, maybe with some Israeli technology. I'm talking about agriculture, talking about healthcare, I'm talking about telecommunication and things like that. And that could happen because maybe it's easier for the Egyptians to go via the Emirates financing than to do it bilaterally with Israel. Okay, so big project. I think they are, first of all, they are very visible, and we are now talking about a period where we probably have to go much more, I won't say underground, but with lower profile. Okay, even now we have Israeli businessmen both in Morocco, in the Emirates. Egypt, we heard about an incident yesterday, which I hope will be cleared up, not as a terror attack, but we have still to wait and see. But there are businessmen, Israeli businessmen, which are there. I mean, some in the Gulf, Israeli have actually, some of them even moved there and make relocation there. But it takes time to build trust, to build those relations, because the business culture of Israel and of its neighbor is extremely different. I mean, we want everything now, and when we come to the Middle East with our neighbors, time is a different framework, and we have still to learn how to combine and to make the complementarity of our two economies. So I'm not so much. It's true that sometimes you need a symbol, and definitely the project of water versus energy, the triangle of Israel, Jordan, and financing by the Emirates, when we will desalinate water for the Jordanian, and they will send us energy, clean energy from solar plant in Jordan, and all this will be financed by the Emirates. This is now on a standstill. But on the other hand, don't forget, we sell gas to Jordan. I think that 20 or 25% of the needs of gas of Jordan are provided by Israel. We sell gas to Egypt because they need our gas. Those are very strategic relations. We don't talk about it too much, and it's better. The less you talk about those big things, the better it is. We have to create confidence between the people, between the business community, and it takes time.
Thank you, and it will take probably more time after what is happening now in the region, so it will be a challenge, but you spell out some opportunities for the future. I want to turn to you, Gabi Bar, now to look at the Palestinian space, because we spoke about the Arab countries. There was some mentioning by Galia about how Israel tried to advance economic means to get quiet from Hamas, and Dan also mentioned that. But in terms of your work along the years on Israeli-Palestinian cooperation, on economic, because we saw so many limitations on the relations, so many crises, but on economic side, coordination, cooperation continued, also on governmental level. So what was the scope of Israeli cooperation with the Palestinian Authority on economic issues before the war? And I also integrate a question by the audience about the Joint Economic Committee that was set at the time, during the Oslo years, and when Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid came into office, one of the goals that was spelled out by the Minister of Regional Cooperation, Isawi Frij, was to renew this committee, maybe work on the Paris Protocol. So can you also reflect to that in your questions? Over to you.
Thank you, Nimrod. Maybe I'll take less than 30 seconds just to say what is the Israeli-Palestinian Chamber of Commerce. This is a binational chamber of commerce in order to assist Israeli businessmen to do business with the Palestinians, and by that as a win-win situation, because you don't do any business if somebody else doesn't want to do it or loses in this business. Then of course it's a win-win for both sides. And we are a non-governmental organization, and for me it's the first non-governmental issue that I handle after so many years in the government. So this is the chamber. Now, actually, no doubt that the war made a lot of influence on what's been happening in our region concerning Israeli Palestinians. First, if I talk about Gaza, I believe that Gaza, the relations are zero. I don't know anything. The only thing is that it moves from Israeli side as well as from other sides is the supply, which is most of it is imported from those countries who assist the Palestinians, and Actually, the only thing is maybe the transportation is done by Israel, so it's very little. With the West Bank or Palestinian Authority, actually there is a lot of influence. For example, the income per capita before the war was about $3,500 in the year. Nowadays, according to the calculations, it's dropped down to 3,500. So from 4,500 to 3,500, it's a lot. It's a lot. Now, workers, they used to work in Israel about 120,000 workers every day. Nowadays, there are less than 10,000 due to government decision, although there are some recommendations from security authorities and coordination that there can be more, but the government decided not to do it, and it makes a lot of problem with the Israeli market, namely construction, infrastructure, services, and so on. And at the same time, for the Palestinians, because it is considered a very, very substantial income for the Palestinians, I mean, for the global economy of the Palestinians, as well as from the private perspective, so that purchasing power was reduced to zero. Now, and one of the consequences is, of course, that the unemployment grew. I don't know to say the numbers, but substantially, I'm sure, substantially, the unemployment is very high. What was before? Now about imports of the Palestinians. When I say imports, just to say that's from abroad and not from Israel, because from Israel I'll elaborate later in a second. Import, it used to be about $300 million on a quarterly basis, and exports about $15 million in a quarterly basis after the war or during the war, and nowadays it's about $240 million of import, and the export surprisingly has grown a bit. Also doubled actually, but the figures are so little that's from 15 to 30. Why is that? Because maybe some of the importers abroad decided to make their imports earlier in order not to lose them, because nobody knows what will happen tomorrow. And maybe some of the surplus that Israel doesn't buy, maybe they still wanted to find some markets to sell, so they doubled it. But again, it's a very low one. Just in the last quarter, it was less than $180 million of imports, and the exports about $26 million. Now, the purchases from Israel, and I say purchases because Danny mentioned it, and maybe Galia as well. We have a special agreement, which is an envelope agreement. It means that actually the bilateral trade is internal trade. It's not an export-import. That's why we differentiate between the two. And the purchases from Israel, they used to be about $420 million monthly. Remember, the numbers for export are for quarter, here's for a month. And the sales kind of exports to Israel were about $130 million. After the war, from 420 dropped down to $300 million, which is a lot. I mean, their purchases from Israel and their sales were dropped down to 70. Now, what is the reason? The reason, very simple. It's a war, uncertainty, and more than that, because of the kind of an unemployment that I said. So it means that the power or the purchase power of the Palestinian, the individual one, became to be less than the others. Now, what does it mean for us for the time being? It means first that we need to hold as much as possible what's been happening right now, and not to let it drop to less than what it is today. And of course, it means that the I would say standard of living of the Palestinians went down because it influenced them very substantially. Now, what we are trying to do now is not a lot, because yet the relations are very, very hidden, I would say. And those who buy, because you see the figures, it's the necessary products, such as, for example, dairy products, which the Palestinians don't have at all, and others. So that's for the time being. And maybe I'll talk later about what we focus that it will be in the future.
So maybe we can go directly into that, into the future.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
in terms of the opportunities for the future, because those within the international community that are looking for prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace sometime in the future are emphasizing the role of incentives, the role of economic incentives in trying to bring the people together. We also see some infrastructure projects like what the Americans are doing with setting up the pier near Gaza that may have future outlook to that. So if you go beyond the immediate nature of the war into the new realities that may take shape afterwards, what is the potential of this Israeli-Palestinian economic cooperation? And is it bilateral in nature, or could it be put within a broader regional umbrella involving other countries, whether in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, Europe, etc.?
Let me say something that might sound arrogant, maybe. But Israelis and Palestinians don't need any third party to tell them how to do the business together. They live quite together, they know how to do the business, and they do it, and you saw the numbers. Now, and the standard of living, of course, grew in the years. Of course, the war stopped it and dropped it to, I would say, a very serious drop to a very low situation. So I think for the bilateral trade, we don't need a third party. I'm inviting anybody to come in, but we know how to do it, and they know how to do it. They have excellent relations. They know personally. They talk. Some of them even today talk, and they just call each other to see that everybody is personally okay vis-a-vis what's been happening in the region. So about bilateral trade, it seems to me that the trade will go back as long as two things happen. First, the war or the hostility goes down. Maybe at the same time, Hamas, I would say, will be not allowed to do whatever to do in order to ruin these relations. And second is the fact that labor will come back to work in Israel because it brings immediately back the purchase power of the individual and the Palestinian individual. So he will need to buy it. So if he buys only, if he used to buy all kind of very, very sweet yogurts and others, now he buys only regular ones. So he will be back to this as well as other products. And of course, they will have also the power maybe to buy imported products that are imported directly or indirectly from Israel or directly from abroad to the Palestinian area. Now, concerning projects and investment, that will take time, because when you initiate project, it needs to see the long-term consequences. And whenever you are not optimistic, then a project will not take place, because people want to see as an endless optimistic future, so that they will be ready to invest some money, and not big money, but yet to invest the money, invest time, and invest maybe some other sources in order to have the business. So I think that it will come back, because we've shown to each other that we can do the business. However, it will take time. Now, concerning Gaza, I think that Israel, I'm not thinking of foreseeing Israel participating as reconstructing Gaza, as if, you know, the son of the jam worker just throws stones, and then his father comes and builds it again or repairs it again. Here, I believe that those countries who will help and who will support, they would like to have their products to be sold as any assistance from foreign countries. However, there are some areas that Israel will be able to make some, I would say, investments or some participation before investment, because the proximity is something that cannot be changed by anything. So I'm optimistic, but on the long term, for the bilateral trade, it will come back. It will come back, but for the investments and rebuilding and going and foreseeing new things, it will take some time.
Thank you. I'm turning here to Gabi Mitchell. We've been hearing, until now, quite a positive outlook in which the damages are not that bad and everything could come back. The one country with which this may not be happening is Turkey. And we saw Turkey that took from early on in the war a very clear position supporting Hamas in a way, announcing that it is cutting the trade with Israel. And throughout the years between Israel and Turkey, despite political tensions, economic relations are always thriving and helping the relations to be resilient. So what has changed? What is happening now between Israel and Turkey? That economic relations are almost the first one to suffer, and do you think there's a way to bounce back out of that once the tensions a bit calm down in Gaza?
Yeah, thank you. I think just by way of creating context, I know that Danny previously mentioned the import and export numbers between Israel and other Arab states. If we were to compare those to bilateral trade between Israel and Turkey, certainly in the last year, we're looking at bilateral trade of somewhere around $9 billion annually. Now, that $9 billion is imbalanced. $7 billion worth of Turkish imports to Israel, $2 billion plus minus of Israeli imports to Turkey. But still, by comparison, we're talking about a much more significant bilateral trade relationship, and one that, as you mentioned, spans the course of many decades, both preceding the free trade agreement that the two parties signed in 1996, and obviously rapidly expanding over the last 10 to 15 years, despite all of the diplomatic tensions that existed between the Israeli government and the Turkish government. So one of the questions I think that's worth asking is, what's different now? What about the circumstances have changed? And also, what are the kind of continual patterns of the Israel-Turkey relationship that give us reason for optimism, or can give us reason to maybe be concerned about this new step? So the first thing that I would say is that the general analysis by most people following Turkey's decision to place a ban on import and export is that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made the decision in light of domestic considerations. There were municipal elections that were recently held in Turkey. His party suffered a historic defeat, and he was criticized both by center-left parties in Turkey and by right-wing and Islamist parties in Turkey for his handling of the war in Gaza and not necessarily putting his money where his mouth is. Erdogan has historically always been very critical of Israeli policy towards Gaza, and specifically has been one of the biggest voices in the Muslim world in support of Hamas. And so he was being challenged by his opposition, by threats from both sides about his lack of execution of that policy vis-a-vis Turkey. And so there's a consensus right now that one of the big reasons as to why he's made this shift is in response to this electoral loss. And even though the primary reason why it seems like most Turks voted for other parties is the Turkish economy, this was low-hanging fruit. He can essentially take it out on Israel and leave everybody else to pick up the pieces. And what do I mean by pick up the pieces? Because while there's an import-export ban, both Turkish companies and Israeli companies can obviously circumvent this ban by delivering their goods and their shipments to third-party countries, and then indirectly sending them to other ports. There have been reports already that Slovenia is one of those countries that is essentially enabling Turkish and Israeli companies to bypass or circumvent this ban. And of course, one of the most critical components of Turkish-Israeli trade is not just the bilateral trade itself, but it's Turkish permission for Azerbaijan to deliver oil to Israel via Turkey's port in Ceyhan. Now, Azerbaijan provides Israel with somewhere around 40% of its oil. Israel is, depending on the quarter, the number one or number two destination of Azerbaijan's oil. And so Turkey hasn't gone that far either, right? So there are reasons to believe that a lot of what's going on is a diplomatic furor. And over the next couple of months, while there might be an increase in prices on particular goods in the Israeli market, in the long run, it not only will hurt Turks, whose economy is currently suffering, and all of those companies are now going to have to creatively find other locations or creative ways of circumventing the ban that their own government has placed on exporting those goods, but it's also going to hurt Palestinians, who are also recipients of Turkish imports via Israel. So I think that there are reasons to understand that the picture is a little bit more complex. But I want to go back to my original point, which is that we need to contextualize this in the bigger relationship between Israel and Turkey. And as I said, during the time that Erdogan has been Turkey's leader, either as prime minister or as president, he's been very vocal and critical of Israeli policy, specifically during periods of escalatory violence between Israel and Hamas. And I think that while we can contextualize his decision to place this ban within the context of Turkish politics, it's also important to remember that there has been a war ongoing between Israel and Hamas, and that Turkey, despite its many efforts, has not been able to secure itself a meaningful role in mediating between the two parties. That role has been given to Qatar and to Egypt. And it also hasn't been able to provide a symbolic position for the purposes of diffusing domestic criticism of government policy. When Turkey asked the Israeli government whether it could participate in humanitarian aid drops, the Israeli government reportedly rejected those requests. So while there's definitely domestic reasons for Erdogan's positioning, we can't separate it from the fact that there is an ongoing war and there is a pattern of behavior where Erdogan and the Turkish government has supported not just the Palestinian people, but Hamas in particular. And over the last 15 years, the two parties, Israel and Turkey, have not been able to find some kind of mechanism that satisfies both sides. The reason why I do think that, despite the fact that it might only hurt the Israeli economy in the short term, some prices might go up, and ultimately Erdogan has left a loophole that once the moment that there's a ceasefire, bilateral trade can resume. Despite all of that, I think that there is a reason to be concerned. And that is because so long as there is no ceasefire, and so long as there is no meaningful mechanism for bilateral dialogue between Israel and Turkey, the longer this ban continues, the more damaging it is to the future of bilateral relations and the future of bilateral trade. If you consider, as Danny had mentioned, that in the context of Arab-Israeli trade, right? Israeli trade with other Arab states, we're just really talking about, a very small quantity of trade and a very small number of companies. Comparatively, Turkish trade is not only incredibly robust, but it's also incredibly diverse. The longer that trade is blocked, the more likely both Turkish companies and Israeli companies are going to look at more affordable options elsewhere, thus reducing the number of voices in each respective civil society that are advocating for the continuation of bilateral relations.
Thank you, Gabi. Can you also briefly relate to the broader energy cooperation within the East Med? I know that Turkey and Israel did not really succeed in cooperating on that in recent years, but there have been other developments with other countries, and it was mentioned that Israel is selling gas to Jordan, to Egypt. We mentioned the East Med Gas Forum. Very briefly, what's happening with energy as a source of cooperation in the East Med in light of the war in Gaza? Before the war, we heard about prospects of developing the Gaza Marine field near Gaza. Where is this all going?
Yes. So in short, and this ties into what Galia mentioned earlier, for large energy projects to be successful, you need political, commercial, and technical feasibility. And so long as there's an ongoing war, the political feasibility just isn't there. And more importantly, a lot of corporate actors, international oil companies, for example, are going to be very reluctant to invest in large-scale projects, which they know isn't going to have the type of political buy-in that's required. So just for the sake of example, I know that we mentioned exports to Egypt and to Jordan. Those exports are continuing, but it's important to note and to point out that for the first 5 weeks of the war, Tamar field, one of Israel's more significant gas fields, was taken offline out of security concerns. And so for 5 weeks, Israel was not being supplied natural gas from that field, nor were its neighboring partners, which is a concerning thing at the corporate level. Corporations want the reliability of supply. States want the reliability of supply. The moment there's a question about the reliability of supply, they're going to have questions about whether there's going to be the same prospect for disruption in the future and for future investments. And I think that maybe the clearest example of it was the decision by ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi State Oil Company and British Petroleum, to put on hold, and I'm putting this diplomatically, to put on hold their planned purchase of 50% of an Israeli gas company, NewMed Energy. I think that, if we look at the kind of context of that deal, which had its own technical challenges and commercial challenges even before the start of the war killed it, right? And it's not going to come back until the geopolitical climate is different. And that's because of I think the sensitivity around large scale projects, which of course energy projects are. You mentioned Israel-Turkey pipeline, not happening. Additional pipelines in other directions. The Israeli government is going to have to be open to maverick ideas, because the dream that it once had of exporting in a lot of different directions has kind of whittled down to a very narrow set of partners, each with their own pros and cons. But the name of the game is diversification of supply. And if you're looking at it 6 months into the war, Israel's net economic opportunities, but specifically in the area of energy, are more limited today than they were 6 months ago.
Thank you. Let's take a round of some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A box, and I will mention the topics of the questions, and then we can give you to pick and choose whatever you'd like to respond to, and we'll do one round to conclude. So there are issues on economic boycotts in Israel. That not necessarily relates to the Arab-Israeli relations, but to Europe, but to the US, maybe to other spaces in the global arena. There is an increase in the calls to boycott Israeli companies or Israeli government. What does that mean? How significant is that? So that's one question. Perhaps, Gadi, on what you mentioned, the negative sides of economic cooperation. Then on the positive side, we didn't speak yet about prospects of Israeli-Saudi normalization. This is being mentioned in the public debate, and we know that the Americans are putting efforts towards that. It's a major incentive for Israel in order to maybe shift some positions on the Palestinian issue. How big are the economic prospects of Israel-Saudi cooperation beyond what is already probably happening now behind the scenes? So that's the second thing. The third is about Israel and Lebanon, because we had, again, a positive context before of the maritime border deal that enabled both countries, because of an economic interest, to reach an ad hoc win-win arrangement, and people thought that would bring stability to the relationship. Is this still relevant given the tensions along the Israel-Lebanese border? And then maybe that's for you, Danny, because I know you were involved in Israel-Lebanon relations in the past. And the fourth and last issue is about whether the Arab population in neighboring countries benefits from economic ties with Israel. Does it spill over to the population, or is it only an elite benefit from those ties with Israel? So those are the issues. We have Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, boycotts, spill over to the public. We'll go again in the order we began, with Galia starting. Don't cover them all. We don't have lots of time, but pick the thing that you feel the most knowledgeable about and give us some insights to wrap up.
Okay, I yield my time to the people who actually know what's happening on the ground. I just want to say that I think it's very obvious from the whole discussion that the role of economic relations also with outside the region, with the US, with Europe, is crucial for all parties. So when Gabi Bao talked about how Israeli-Palestinian relations are actually, I won't say self-sufficient, but we don't need we don't need someone else to build the infrastructure for us. I think the role of the third parties here is crucial and will be crucial when we're talking about the reconstruction of Gaza as an opportunity for more actors to be involved. But I'm actually more interested to hear everyone else here, so I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you,
I'll
guys.
try to be quick. I mean, the issue of boycott is an issue that preoccupies us. Past experience have shown that actually the economic boycott had very, very little influence, but it doesn't mean that if anti-Israeli mood and the situation deteriorate politically for Israel in the Western hemisphere, etc., that might have an effect, and we shouldn't take it lightly. But on the other hand, when you look at Israeli export composition, most of it are intermediary products. So this is something that is, again, I mean, it's very difficult to identify what you are actually want to boycott. The issue of disinvestment, or what I call the silent boycott, those are issues that we are dealing with. But again, on the other hand, Israel sees some edge on technology, and a lot of companies are looking for technology. So I don't minimize the problem, but I think that we should not be too frightened about it. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, definitely that's the big I would say opportunity in the region, because Saudi Arabia is undergoing huge transformation that actually could definitely take advantage of Israel technology and Israel know-how and the proximity. But again, a lot is happening under the table now. Obviously, it might be much easier to do it when it's on the table, and definitely it all depends on again, is normalization really going to happen? If it does, I think it's a game changer in the economic relation of Israel in the region. Okay, again, if we know how to do it wisely, and Israelis are not exactly the wisest people when it comes to suddenly have relation with a new country. Usually the Israelis are so enthusiastic that it creates some problem on the receiving end. So we have to do it quietly, slowly, and in a good manner. Lebanon is a major issue nowadays in Israel, definitely the northern border and what's happening. And again, on the Israeli side, look, the situation there, I think that if you look at the potential of cooperation with Lebanon, you know, Israelis of my age were always brought up by saying, we don't know who is going to be the first country to sign peace with Israel, but we know the second one will be Lebanon. Now, I would say that actually it's not the reality at all. It's going to probably be the last country to sign a peace with Israel because of the internal problem in Lebanon. But if you look at the potential of cooperation and complementarity between the Lebanese, I would say, creativity and ingenuity, because their economy, although it's going through tremendous problem, I think that there is a potential there, but it is really not in the near future and demands a very major change inside Lebanon. And the role of Hezbollah there is only destructive, both for Israel and certainly also for Lebanon itself. When it comes to spill over to the public, look, we are dealing here, and I know we are talking here to a Western audience. Okay, I mean the societies in the Middle East, and taking Israel out, are different types of societies. They are tribal societies. Some of them, the relation between government and the people, between what we call in Israel the center of power, and how that it filters to the population. Those are not market economy that we can analyze what we know from Western countries to totally different type of system. So to try to analyze what happened in societies which are governed by different codes of conduct and different business culture, and to try to impose on them our vision of economic development is very tricky. I think that, yes, you look at, I mean, Egypt is a huge country with over 100 million people, which is in dire straits, and there certainly nothing spill over, okay? And the country is controlled by a military establishment, and I won't go into all that. So it's really the whole story. The Gulf countries, again, we're talking about a local population of what in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, 1.5 million local one and 8 million expatriates. So yes, I mean, this is a totally different type of economy that functions. Morocco, again, is different. Obviously, at the end of the day, economic development should benefit the well-being of the population, of the inhabitants, and we believe that it should. Israel, in a way, we have got our own problem, but again, we can, in Israel, I'm sure that people, when you talk about the fruit of peace, a lot of people would like to benefit from that. And by the way, again, there are indirect benefits. The peace with Egypt that maybe didn't have purely direct economic result, certainly the Israeli takeoff economically is the result of the peace with Egypt that actually enabled Israel to not reduce, but not increase its military spending because we had peace with the biggest Arab country and our neighbor. And that enabled Israel budget to grow in other areas and not only in the military one. So you see, it's a very complicated issue. And I think I covered and Turkey, for the last question, someone there talked about Turkey. Look, yes, there is a problem with Turkey, but you know what? Israel does not depend on Turkey for any of its import products. And there are alternatives, maybe a bit more expensive, it takes more time, but Israel does not depend on Turkey for any of its products. So, and I think, unfortunately, if the situation continues with Turkey, the damage to the Turkish economy is going to be probably bigger than the damage to the Israeli economy. But again, I don't like mixing economics and politics. And unfortunately, that's the first time in many years of up and down in relation between Israel and Turkey that the economic dimension has been brought into the picture. And this is really sad because, I mean, we definitely should try to separate wherever we can the economic dimension from the political one. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Gabi, if you would like also to put a word in on Egypt and the queues, that's an opportunity.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll pick up the benefit for the simple citizen in the Arab countries. First and foremost, for the Palestinians, it's a very direct influence because we see that, as I said, labor in Israel, their income, unemployment. So whenever things go back to what we call normal, then the Palestinians will be the first to
mute.
feel it and to have their benefits. Now, I can say about Egypt that there is some benefit, although there are over 100 million people over there. But, you know, the QIZ, the good times, had about 1,000 factories. Now, factories in Egypt is not like in Israel that you have 20 workers. Over there, we're talking about thousands of workers. It means that those thousands of workers get salaries, and each of them goes back home and actually supports or maintains the whole family, sometimes even the mother and father-in-law. So it means that everybody of them has about 10 people who are actually sitting around their table. So it means that if the QIZ had sometimes they said even 500,000 workers altogether from all the factories, it meant a lot. It meant a lot. Having said that, since we're talking about a big country, a huge country from our perspective for sure, is that yet it's not enough. But for other countries, I wouldn't say Jordan, not so necessarily, because they unfortunately they imported foreign labor in order to hire even lower income or lower salaries for that. Egypt used it at all, I mean, for all benefits in this respect. And others, I don't know about other countries, it's very marginal.
Thank you. And Gabi Mitchell, over to you.
If anything, this conversation is enlightening for how Israelis perceive the relative economic stability of our neighbors. I'll be interested in what MEI puts together to bring in experts from those respective countries, because I do think that there is there is a bit of a gap in terms of kind of our understanding of what these countries are economically from the outside versus from the inside. And I definitely think that a Palestinian perspective on the relationship, the economic relationship with Israel is probably quite different than the way that we've presented it. And I just want to be cognizant of those differences. Regarding Lebanon, very quickly, Hezbollah presents a huge security challenge for Israel, and I don't even think that realistically anybody should be talking about direct or bilateral trade between Israel and Lebanon. If I was to create a devil's argument, it would be that Hezbollah, at least to my knowledge, has not fired any of its rockets in the direction of the maritime space. So maybe in some kind of strange way, the maritime agreement is being upheld, even if other agreements have been violated. And obviously, it's the fact that those other agreements that have been violated that makes you have concerns about the maritime security for Israel's offshore platforms that are closer to the Israeli-Lebanese border, right? So, and the final thing, I think it's important to kind of talk about the question of boycott and divestment, because it's been present within Western capitals for many decades. It's kind of come to the fore over the last couple of weeks or months as a result of the war. I think that it's something that Israelis need to take seriously, because while on the one hand, governments don't necessarily need to follow, and corporations don't need to follow what the public or what particular camps within a respective public are demanding. At the same time, if that population within a particular country grows, then it can have undue effect on that government's economic policy. And we saw it over the last couple of days between Israel and Turkey, a commercial relationship that we thought was unbreakable in many ways, because it had seen previous waves of diplomatic issues, and yet the commercial ties stood still. And so I think that it's something that from an Israeli perspective needs to be taken seriously, because it isn't something that necessarily happens overnight, but it's about social change and changes within audiences in other countries that Israel has limited control over, unless, of course, it addresses the biggest elephant in the room, which is direct engagement with the Palestinians about some kind of resolution to the conflict, not just the conflict in Gaza, but the conflict overall.
Thank you, Gabi, for these wise words with which we'll end our webinar, also for spelling out some issues that we should continue to look at and engage more people from all countries and create these spaces for joint Israeli-Arab regional conversation on politics, but also an economy. So I thank you, all of you, for bringing your knowledge, expertise, and insights into this conversation. I thank the audience, I thank the staff at MEI, Molly, Mahin, and others who helped make this happen. You could also look into our MEI's website to see all other analysis and webinars that have been published throughout the month of the war on various aspects of regional elements relating to that, to Israeli affairs, and I'll see you all next time.